The grocery store buzzed with the mundane hum of life, carts clattering, children whining for candy, and distant announcements about discounts. James, a young man in his early 20s, stood by the fresh produce section, carefully examining avocados. His broad shoulders and calm demeanor exuded a quiet confidence, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to erupt nearby. Margaret, an elderly woman with a stern face framed by a shock of silver hair, entered the aisle. Her cane tapped sharply against the tiled floor, her expression sour as she scanned the shelves. She moved closer to James, her cart squeaking in protest, and paused a few feet away. Her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, a frown carving deeper lines into her face. It was clear she was watching him, not out of curiosity, but with an air of judgment. The tension became palpable when she spoke. "Why don't you go back to Africa?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the soft hum of the store like a blade. The sentence hung in the air, suspended, as if the very walls of the store held their breath. James froze. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard her. He turned his head slowly, meeting her cold, piercing gaze. Around them, shoppers stopped mid-step, their conversations and movements halting as they tuned into the unfolding confrontation. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" James asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of disbelief. His hands clenched the avocado he'd been holding, its smooth surface digging into his palms. Margaret didn't flinch. She straightened, her frail frame bolstered by a lifetime of privilege. "I said, you people should go back to where you came from." The air crackled with shock. A middle-aged man by the oranges dropped a bag of fruit, the sound startling but somehow distant against the backdrop of Margaret's words. A young mother by the apples gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her toddler tugged at her sleeve, oblivious to the storm brewing. James' face tightened, the muscles in his jaw working as he processed her words. "I was born here," he said, his voice even, though his eyes betrayed the fury boiling beneath the surface. "This is where I come from." Margaret scoffed, her thin lips curling into a sneer. "Doesn't matter. This country wasn't made for people like you. You're the reason everything's going downhill." A woman by the tomatoes, dressed in a sharp business suit, stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her tone icy. "That is completely unacceptable. You have no right." "Mind your own business," Margaret snapped, her grip tightening on her cane as she glared at the woman. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." The businesswoman didn't back down. "What everyone else is thinking? Lady, you're the only one spewing this filth. How dare you?" James raised a hand to stop the woman. He didn't need a savior. "I appreciate it," he said quietly, his focus still on Margaret. "But I can handle this." He stepped closer to Margaret, the space between them charged. "You don't know me," he said firmly. "You don't know my story, my struggles, or my worth. You see my skin and think it tells you everything, but it doesn't. It tells you nothing." Margaret faltered, the weight of his words momentarily causing her to step back. But her defiance returned, a shield of ignorance she refused to drop. "People like you think you're so special," she muttered, though her voice wavered slightly. "People like me?" James repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You mean people who've had to fight twice as hard to get half as much? People who've had to endure this kind of hatred their entire lives? You don't even know what you're talking about." Around them, the crowd grew. Whispers filled the space, some condemning Margaret, others murmuring in agreement with James. A teenage cashier, wide-eyed, whispered into a walkie-talkie, likely calling the manager. Margaret's gaze flickered to the growing crowd, her confidence beginning to wane under the scrutiny. Still, she clung to her righteousness. "I'm not the bad guy here," she said, her voice louder as if she could drown out the rising murmurs. "I'm just saying—" "Enough," a deep voice interrupted. The store manager, a tall man in his 40s with a commanding presence, approached. "Ma'am, we don't tolerate hate speech in this store. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Margaret's face turned red. "I'm a paying customer." "And so is everyone else here," the manager replied firmly. "But your behavior is unacceptable. If you don't leave, I'll have to call security." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked around, searching for support, but found none. Even those who might have secretly agreed with her earlier shrank away, unwilling to face public condemnation. She huffed, grabbed her cart, and turned sharply, her cane clicking furiously as she stomped away. The crowd parted for her, and as she disappeared, the tension began to lift. James exhaled, the adrenaline leaving his body in a rush. The businesswoman placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Thanks." The manager turned to James, his expression apologetic. "I'm so sorry that happened here. If there's anything I can do." James shook his head. "It's not your fault," he said. "This happens everywhere." The store gradually returned to normal, but for those who witnessed the incident, the air still buzzed with the residue of anger and discomfort. James walked out with his groceries, his head held high, a quiet determination in his step. James stood motionless for a moment, his face betraying no emotion as the murmurs around him swelled. The echoes of Margaret's words lingered in the air like the aftershocks of an earthquake. He glanced at the growing crowd, his eyes scanning faces, some supportive, some shocked, and a few quietly curious. Then he spoke, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. "You want me to go back to Africa?" James asked, his gaze locking onto Margaret, who now stood frozen several feet away. Her hands tightened around the handle of her cart, her eyes narrowing in defiance. "Let me tell you something about where I'm from. My ancestors didn't come here by choice, they were dragged here in chains. But they stayed, survived, and built this country in ways you can't begin to imagine." His voice grew louder, not with anger, but with a fiery clarity that demanded attention. The crowd shifted closer, their eyes fixed on him as he continued. "My great-great-grandfather was born into slavery, whipped and beaten while working fields he could never own. But he survived. He fought his way to freedom and became a farmer, owning land for the first time in his family's history. My grandfather? He fought in World War II. He wore the uniform of a country that denied him basic human rights and risked his life so people like you," his eyes flicked toward Margaret, "could have the freedom to spew this kind of hatred." Margaret's face turned red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. "I don't need a history lesson," she snapped, but her voice was quieter now, her bravado cracked under the weight of the crowd's disapproving stares. "Oh, but you do," James shot back, his tone firm. "You think you have the right to tell me where I belong? My family's been here for generations, working, contributing, and fighting for a country that's constantly told us we're not enough. You don't know me, but I'm a product of resilience. I have a degree in engineering, and I'm building the infrastructure that keeps this country running. What have you done lately, Margaret? Besides stirring up hate in a grocery store?" The crowd let out a collective gasp at his pointed words. Margaret's lips trembled as she struggled to come up with a retort. "You think you're so high and mighty," she spat. "But you don't belong here. You'll never belong here." A man in a business suit, the same one who had dropped his oranges earlier, stepped forward. "Ma'am, that's enough," he said firmly. "You're embarrassing yourself." Margaret whipped her head toward him, her anger reigniting. "Why don't you mind your own business?" she snapped. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," the man replied, his voice calm but resolute. "Because hatred like yours is a stain on all of us. You should be ashamed." James glanced at the man and nodded slightly in thanks. But he wasn't finished. He turned back to Margaret, his expression softening but his resolve unshaken. "You know what's ironic?" he said, his voice quieter now but no less impactful. "I bet you think you're a patriot. But true patriots don't tear others down. They lift people up even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable. You want me to leave?" "No, Margaret. I'm staying. Because this is my country too. And I won't let people like you make me feel less than." Margaret's knuckles whitened as she gripped her cart. "I'm not listening to this," she muttered, shoving her way toward the exit. The crowd parted for her, their silence speaking louder than any words. As she disappeared through the sliding doors, the tension in the air began to dissipate. The store manager, who had been watching silently, stepped forward. "James," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "On behalf of the store, I want to apologize. No one should ever have to go through something like that. James sighed, the adrenaline leaving his body. It's not your fault, he said, glancing at the faces around him. But this kind of thing happens all the time. It's not just words. It's a mentality that people like Margaret carry with them everywhere they go. The businesswoman from earlier, who had defended James, spoke up again. What can we do to help? She asked, her tone earnest. James paused, his gaze moving over the crowd. Speak up when you see it, he said finally. Don't let people like her think they're the majority. And educate yourselves. Racism isn't just loud moments like this. It's woven into the fabric of our systems. Challenge it? The crowd murmured their agreement, and slowly, the tension melted into a collective determination. A teenage cashier who had been watching from behind the counter walked up to James, her voice trembling but filled with admiration. You handled that so well, she said. I don't think I could have stayed that calm. James gave her a small smile. You don't always have to stay calm, he said. But you do have to stand up. As the crowd began to disperse, James turned to leave, his head held high. He could feel the weight of the encounter pressing on his shoulders, but it wasn't a burden he carried alone. Today, he had spoken his truth. And though it hadn't changed Margaret's mind, it had awakened something in the people around him. The businesswoman caught up to him as he walked toward his car. James, she called, and he turned. If you ever want to share your story with a larger audience, I work for a local news station. We'd love to have you on. James hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Maybe, he said. It's time people started listening. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the store fading into the distance. It had been just another stop on his list that morning, but it had become a moment that none of them would forget. James stood firmly, his gaze steady and unyielding as the crowd buzzed around him. He took a deep breath, the weight of generations pressing on him, but not breaking him. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and deliberate, cutting through the murmurs like a sharp wind. You want to know why I belong here? He began, his eyes locking onto Margaret, who lingered near the exit, unwilling to leave but too humiliated to stay center stage. Let me tell you about my family. Let me tell you about what it means to survive and to contribute to a country that hasn't always welcomed us. The crowd quieted, the gravity of his words pulling everyone into his story. My ancestors were slaves, James continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. They were dragged to this land in chains, torn from their families, and stripped of their humanity. They weren't seen as people, they were property. But even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, they built this country. The wealth, the infrastructure, the very foundations of America, they're stained with the sweat and blood of my ancestors. And yet, they endured. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, ensuring no one missed the weight of his words. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her defiance faltering as James pressed on. My grandfather fought in World War II, James said, his voice rising with pride. He wore the uniform of this country, risking his life on foreign soil, even as he faced segregation at home. Do you know what it's like to fight for a country that won't even let you sit at the same lunch counter as other soldiers? That's the legacy of my family, courage and sacrifice in the face of injustice. Margaret's lips thinned, her discomfort palpable. That doesn't mean anything, she muttered under her breath, but James heard her. It means everything, James shot back, his tone sharper now. It means my family has done more for this country than you could ever imagine. My parents? They grew up during the civil rights movement. They marched, they protested, and they fought for the rights that people like you take for granted. And through it all, they taught me kindness, hard work, dignity. James turned to address the crowd now, his voice carrying the weight of his conviction. They taught me to believe in this country, even when it didn't believe in us. They taught me to stand tall, even when people like Margaret tried to tear us down. A few people clapped softly, their support building like a wave. Margaret's face reddened further, her indignation now mingled with shame. She gripped her cart tightly, her knuckles white, as if she could anchor herself against the rising tide of disapproval. And you, James said, turning back to Margaret, you think you can erase that with a few hateful words? You think you can intimidate me? I stand on the shoulders of giants, Men and women who endured far worse than your ignorance and still found the strength to rise. You don't get to decide who belongs here. This is my home. This is my country. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The crowd's silence was deafening, their collective judgment a mirror reflecting her ugliness back at her. James wasn't finished. You asked me to go back to Africa, he said, his tone calm but cutting. But let me ask you something, Margaret. Where should you go back to? Because unless you're Native American, your family came from somewhere else too. Or does your idea of belonging only apply to people who look like you? The crowd murmured in agreement, a few people nodding. A teenage boy with a mop of curly hair stepped forward. He's right, the boy said, his voice cracking but resolute. We're all immigrants in one way or another. Margaret glared at the boy, her lips curling in disdain. This is different, she snapped, her voice breaking. We built this country. No, we all built it, James interrupted, his voice firm. My family's blood, sweat, and tears are in the soil of this land, just like yours. The only difference is, we've been doing it while people like you tried to keep us down. The manager, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward again. James, he said, his tone apologetic, I am so sorry this happened here. It's unacceptable. It's not just here, James said, shaking his head. It's everywhere. And it's not just words. It's the systems, the policies, the unspoken rules that tell people like me will never be enough. A woman in a business suit from earlier raised her hand slightly, as if asking permission to speak. What can we do? She asked, her tone earnest. Challenge it, James said simply. When you hear it, when you see it, don't let it slide. It's not enough to just not be racist. You have to be anti-racist. You have to speak up even when it's uncomfortable. The crowd nodded, their discomfort giving way to a collective determination. Margaret, now visibly shaken, mumbled something under her breath and turned toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one spoke to her. She left alone, her shame trailing her like a shadow. As the tension in the air began to dissipate, James exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment lifting slightly. A young woman with bright pink hair approached him cautiously. That was incredible, she said. You're so brave. James smiled faintly, his shoulders relaxing. I'm not brave, he said. I'm just tired. Tired of having to explain why I belong. The manager clapped James on the shoulder. If you ever want to share your story with a wider audience, he said, I know some people in local media who'd love to talk to you. James nodded thoughtfully. Maybe, he said. But for now, I'm just going to keep living my life. That's resistance too. As James walked out of the store, his head held high, the crowd slowly returned to their shopping. But the air felt different, charged with the echoes of his words. It wasn't just another day at the grocery store, it was a reminder of the power of resilience, the weight of history, and the strength it takes to stand tall in the face of hate. The air in the grocery store had shifted. Where moments earlier it had been crackling with tension, now it was heavy with reflection. James's words lingered like the echo of a distant bell, ringing in the ears of everyone who had heard them. Conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by a pensive silence as customers mulled over what they had just witnessed. Margaret stood near the sliding doors, her hand gripping the handle of her cart. Her face, still flushed from the confrontation, was now etched with something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Her gaze flicked around the store, meeting the eyes of a few onlookers who quickly averted their stares. The confidence that had driven her hateful words now seemed brittle, as though James's speech had chipped away at it, leaving her exposed. James, standing near the produce aisle, watched Margaret with measured calm. He wasn't angry anymore, he was resolved. He had said what needed to be said, but he could see the impact his words had made, not just on Margaret, but on everyone around them. The businesswoman who had spoken up earlier was still nearby, her arms crossed as she studied Margaret with a look of quiet satisfaction. She seemed ready to interject again if necessary, but for now she remained silent, giving Margaret the space to grapple with her discomfort. The teenage cashier by the counter whispered something to a colleague, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration for James and disbelief at Margaret's audacity. Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice low and trembling. She started, then stopped, her words catching in her throat. She looked down at her hands as though searching for answers in the creases of her knuckles. James didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His silence was a mirror, forcing Margaret to confront her reflection. The onlookers, still hovering nearby, seemed to hold their collective breath, waiting to see what she would do next. "I didn't mean," Margaret began again, but the words sounded hollow, insincere. She shook her head, frustration mounting. "I was just speaking my mind." "Your mind?" The businesswoman couldn't hold back any longer. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of her disbelief. "Your mind just insulted an entire community and told a man he doesn't belong in his own country. If that's what's in your mind, maybe it's time to re-examine it." Margaret flinched, her lips tightening into a thin line. She looked around, as if searching for support, but found none. The crowd was watching her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disapproval. Even the young mother who had gasped earlier now stood with her arms protectively around her child, her expression unreadable but clearly not on Margaret's side. James stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding but not threatening. "It's not about what you meant," he said, his voice softer now but no less firm. "It's about what you said. Words have power, Margaret. They hurt. They divide. And whether you meant them or not, they show what's in your heart." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes glistening. It was hard to tell whether they were tears of anger or something deeper. "I've never been a hateful person," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know why I said it. It just came out." The man in the business suit, who had been quietly observing, spoke next. "Maybe it's time to ask yourself why it came out. Because words like that don't just slip. They're rooted in something. And if you don't confront it, you'll keep hurting people, whether you mean to or not." Margaret's hand moved to her chest, clutching at her collar as though trying to steady her breathing. For the first time, she looked genuinely shaken, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own actions. Around them, the crowd began to disperse slightly, the intensity of the moment easing. But a few people lingered, still watching, still invested. The teenage boy who had defended James earlier approached him hesitantly. "Sir," he said, his voice shy but earnest, "what you said it was amazing. I've never heard anyone talk like that." James gave the boy a small, encouraging smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "It's important to speak up, even when it's hard." The boy nodded, his cheeks flushing with pride at having been acknowledged. Margaret, overhearing their exchange, seemed to shrink further into herself. Her gaze darted toward the exit, but she didn't move, as though rooted in place by the weight of her shame. "I've never thought of it that way," she mumbled, more to herself than anyone else. "I've always believed. I've always thought." Her voice trailed off, and she looked up at James, her expression a mixture of confusion and regret. "Maybe I don't know as much as I thought I did." "None of us know everything," James said gently. "But the important thing is to be willing to learn, to listen, to grow." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, clearly overwhelmed. She muttered something that sounded like "I'm sorry," though it was barely audible. The businesswoman stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. "You know," she said, "it's not too late to change. To unlearn the things you've been taught. But it starts with acknowledging the harm you've done." Margaret nodded weakly, her tears now spilling over. She wiped at her face with a trembling hand, then turned and began to walk toward the exit, her steps slow and uncertain. As she left, the crowd began to disperse fully, the moment passing but leaving its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. James stood quietly watching her go, his heart heavy but hopeful. The teenage cashier approached him again, her voice timid but filled with admiration. "Do you think she'll really change?" she asked. James paused, considering the question. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I hope so. We all have to start somewhere." As he gathered his groceries and headed for the checkout, James felt a mixture of emotions, pride, exhaustion, and a lingering sadness for Margaret and others like her. But above all, he felt a quiet determination. Today had been a small victory, but the fight was far from over. And he was ready for it. As the echoes of Margaret's retreat faded into the hum of the grocery store, the atmosphere shifted again. Where tension and shame had once thickened the air, something new began to take its place, a quiet sense of unity. People who had watched the confrontation unfold now stepped forward, their expressions filled with gratitude, curiosity, and respect. The businesswoman approached James first. Her sharp, confident demeanor had softened, her eyes reflecting a mixture of admiration and guilt. "I just want to say thank you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "You stood up not just for yourself but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. That takes strength." James gave her a small nod, his calm composure unshaken. "Thank you," he replied. "But this wasn't just about me. It's about all of us standing up to ignorance and hate, no matter where it comes from." Others began to gather around him, drawn by his words and the courage he'd displayed. A middle-aged man in a flannel shirt stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "I'm not one to get involved in things like this," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But what you did, it mattered. People need to hear it." James shook the man's hand, his grip firm but his expression gentle. "We all need to hear it," he said. "Every time we let this kind of thing slide, we send a message that it's okay. It's not." The teenage boy who had spoken up earlier stood nearby, his hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. He shuffled closer, his eyes wide with a mix of admiration and nervousness. "You're like a hero," he blurted out, his cheeks flushing. "I mean, the way you handled her, it was amazing." James smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just someone who's tired of staying silent." "But you spoke up to... That took guts." The boy straightened slightly, pride flickering across his face. "I just couldn't let her talk to you like that," he said. "It didn't feel right." A ripple of agreement passed through the small crowd that had gathered. The young mother, who had clutched her child tightly during the confrontation, stepped forward now, her toddler balanced on her hip. "I want to thank you too," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For my son. I don't ever want him to grow up thinking it's okay to treat people that way." Her words hit James in a tender spot. He smiled at the child, who stared back at him with curious eyes. "It starts with what we teach them," he said. "Kindness, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what's right." The store manager, who had been observing quietly from a distance, approached now. His expression was earnest, his voice filled with regret. "James, I can't tell you how sorry I am that this happened here," he said. "If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please let me know." James regarded the manager thoughtfully. "You can make sure this store is a place where everyone feels welcome," he said. "Train your staff to handle situations like this, to call out discrimination when they see it." The manager nodded vigorously. "Absolutely," he said. "Consider it done." By now, even the employees behind the counters had begun to drift closer, their faces reflecting a mix of admiration and resolve. One of them, a young woman with bright pink hair, stepped forward hesitantly. "I've never seen anyone do what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't think I could have been that brave." James looked at her, his expression kind but firm. "You don't have to be brave all the time," he said. "But when the moment comes and you know something is wrong, you speak up. Even if your voice shakes." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she nodded, his words clearly resonating. As the crowd around James grew, so did the conversation. People shared stories of times they had witnessed or experienced discrimination, their voices tentative at first but growing stronger with each word. The businesswoman recounted a time she had stayed silent when a coworker made a racist joke and vowed to do better. The middle-aged man spoke about a friend who had faced similar hostility and how he regretted not standing up for him. Through it all, James listened, offering words of encouragement and wisdom. He didn't see himself as a leader, but his presence and the strength of his convictions had turned him into one. Eventually, the teenage cashier stepped forward again, her hands twisting nervously. "Do you think she'll change?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James considered the question, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "But change doesn't happen overnight. It starts with moments like this, with people challenging their beliefs and realizing the harm they've done." What matters is that we don't give up, no matter how long it takes. The crowd murmured in agreement, their energy now one of hope and determination. Margaret's hateful words had been a spark, but James's response had turned it into a fire that burned away apathy and left a renewed sense of purpose in its place. As James finally stepped away to pay for his groceries, the store felt different. People who had been strangers mere moments ago were now exchanging nods of solidarity, their interactions tinged with a newfound awareness. The teenage boy called out as James reached the checkout. "Hey man, what's your name?" James turned, his face breaking into a small smile. "James," he said simply. "Well, James," the boy said, grinning, "you're kind of a badass." James chuckled softly, the weight of the encounter lifting slightly. "Thanks," he said. "But remember, it's not about being a badass. It's about doing the right thing." As he walked out of the store, his head held high, James felt a sense of quiet pride. He hadn't set out to make a statement that day, but sometimes, the moment finds you. And in those moments, standing up can make all the difference, not just for yourself, but for an entire community. Margaret sat alone in her modest living room later that evening, the silence around her a stark contrast to the cacophony in her mind. The confrontation at the grocery store replayed endlessly, each word striking her anew. James's calm, piercing gaze haunted her thoughts, his words echoing like a relentless drumbeat. Words have power. They hurt. They divide. For the first time in years, Margaret felt unsure of herself. Her beliefs, once solid as stone, now seemed riddled with cracks. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who spoke her mind and upheld traditional values. But the faces of the people in the store, the disapproving stares, the quiet judgment, made her question everything. Margaret reached for her tea, her hands trembling slightly. She thought about the teenage boy who had spoken up, the young mother clutching her child, and the businesswoman who had so fearlessly called her out. They had all stood against her, united in their rejection of the things she'd said. And then there was James, standing tall and dignified, unbroken even as her words sought to diminish him. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "A seed of change." The next morning, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open before her. She hadn't touched it in weeks, but something inside her compelled her to act. She typed American history contributions of African Americans into the search bar, her fingers hesitating before she hit enter. As the page filled with articles, images, and videos, she began to read. She learned about the contributions of enslaved people who built the infrastructure of the United States. She read about African American soldiers who fought valiantly in every war, from the Revolution to World War II, often while denied the rights they were defending. She saw photographs of civil rights activists marching peacefully, their faces resolute in the face of hatred. With each story, Margaret's chest tightened. These were not tales of people who didn't belong. They were stories of resilience, courage, and undeniable contributions to the country she had always claimed to love. Her tea grew cold as she clicked through link after link, her understanding slowly expanding. She thought of James's words, "You don't get to decide who belongs here." For the first time, she saw how small and petty her perspective had been, how blind she had been to the lives and struggles of others. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the weight of her ignorance pressing down on her. She wasn't ready to call herself an ally, not yet. But a seed of change had been planted, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. James's story spreads. Meanwhile, James's story had begun to ripple beyond the walls of the grocery store. A young woman with bright pink hair, the cashier who had watched the confrontation unfold, had taken to social media that night. She posted a heartfelt video recounting what she had witnessed, her voice trembling with emotion. "This man, James, he stood up to hate in the most incredible way," she said, tears glistening in her eyes. "He didn't shout or retaliate. He just spoke his truth, and it was so powerful. I'll never forget it." Her video went viral within hours. Comments poured in from people around the country, praising James's courage and the way he had handled the situation. Others shared similar stories, inspired by the reminder that standing up against hate could make a difference. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon James found himself at the center of a growing movement. The businesswoman who had supported him in the store reached out, offering to connect him with journalists and community leaders who wanted to amplify his message. At first, James hesitated. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. But after some thought, he realized that sharing his story could inspire others to challenge hatred and ignorance in their own lives. He began speaking at schools, community centers, and local events, sharing the story of his ancestors, his family, and the confrontation at the grocery store. His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations and igniting a desire for change. Margaret's turning point. One day, as Margaret scrolled through her social media feed, she stumbled upon a video of James speaking at a local event. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the play button, before finally pressing it. In the video, James stood before a crowd, his posture relaxed but commanding. He recounted the incident in the store, but he didn't name Margaret or vilify her. Instead, he focused on the broader message, the power of kindness, the importance of confronting prejudice, and the need for collective growth. Change starts with one person, James said, his voice steady. It starts with one moment, one decision to choose empathy over ignorance. We all have the capacity to change, no matter where we've been or what we've believed. Margaret's throat tightened as she watched him speak. His words felt like they were meant for her, and she realized with a jolt that she wanted to change. She needed to. Taking the first step. The next morning, Margaret gathered her courage and walked into a local community center. She had seen a flyer advertising a discussion group focused on confronting bias and fostering understanding. The thought of walking into that room terrified her, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Inside, she found a circle of people, diverse in age, race, and background, all gathered to share their stories and learn from one another. When it was her turn to speak, Margaret's voice shook as she recounted the confrontation with James. "I said things I'm ashamed of," she admitted, her hands trembling. "But that man, he showed me that I've been wrong. I don't want to be that person anymore." The group listened without judgment, offering her the support she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the possibility of redemption. A ripple of hope. As James's story continued to spread, and Margaret worked quietly to confront her own biases, the community began to change. Conversations about race, history, and inclusion became more frequent, more open. People who had once stayed silent in the face of hatred found the courage to speak up. And James, though he hadn't set out to be a leader, became a symbol of resilience and hope. His story reminded people that change was possible, not just for individuals like Margaret, but for entire communities willing to confront their past and build a better future. In the end, it wasn't just a confrontation in a grocery store. It was the beginning of something far greater.